You think obedience is restriction. You assume freedom means following your own will without interference. To obey, in your view, is to lose the right to think for yourself. But Al-Ghazali questioned this belief. He asked whether what you call freedom is not independence, but merely obedience to desire. He saw that the self which insists on autonomy is already bound, not by others, but by its own compulsions. What appears as choice is often reaction. What feels like power is dependence on impulse. He proposed a reversal. True freedom is obedience to what is real. For the one who aligns with truth, there is no conflict left to resist. So, which is freer? The will that follows every impulse, or the one that follows what cannot deceive? Al-Ghazali lived at the height of intellectual mastery. He taught in the greatest centers of learning and commanded the language of philosophy, theology, and law. Yet his mind collapsed under the weight of its own arguments. He could no longer trust the reasoning he had perfected. In withdrawal, he discovered that knowledge without inner obedience leads to endless division. The intellect that becomes clever in argument but blind to meaning. From this crisis emerged his insight. Obedience is not a social command, but an existential law. The recognition that thought itself must submit to truth before it can know. You equate freedom with choice. You believe you are free because you can decide. But if your decisions are ruled by habit, fear, or desire, what freedom remains? Al-Ghazali said that a mind ruled by impulse is not free. It is merely active. You obey what you crave and call it independence. Each want becomes a master. Each preference becomes an order you follow. The will that resists discipline ends up divided among its own demands. The self fragments, pulled by countless directions of wanting. You begin to see. The freedom you defend is obedience in disguise. Obedience to what constantly changes. Al-Ghazali distinguished between two forms of obedience. The first is external. Submission to authority, to law, to command. The second is internal. Awareness of the structure that reality already follows. The first may limit the body, but the second liberates the mind. To obey reality is not to surrender judgment, but to see what judgment cannot alter. The laws of truth are not imposed from outside. They are discovered from within. When you begin to perceive this order, you realize that disobedience is not rebellion. It is ignorance of what already governs thought. The mind cannot escape what it depends upon. You resist obedience because you believe it weakens you. The ego measures strength by control and control by command. To yield feels like defeat. But Al-Ghazali observed that the ego's refusal is its real bondage. It fights not because it knows truth, but because it fears insignificance. It must feel separate to feel alive. Yet this separation is illusion. The mind cannot isolate itself from what sustains it. The ego that refuses obedience obeys itself instead. It becomes trapped within its own reactions. Rebellion becomes a habit, and even defiance becomes obedience to pride. Can such defiance ever be freedom? For Al-Ghazali, obedience was not moral submission, but intellectual discipline. He treated it as a method of purification. The mind must learn to observe itself, to test every conclusion until it exposes its motive. When you obey this discipline, you begin to notice which thoughts arise from clarity and which from attachment. Reason becomes transparent rather than defensive. It no longer argues for the self. It examines it. To obey truth is to stop negotiating with it. When thinking ceases to protect its illusions, it begins to understand. Freedom is not the right to think whatever you wish. It is the capacity to think without distortion. You fear surrender because you think it means loss of will. Yet Al-Ghazali said that surrender does not destroy the will. It reveals its origin. The moment you obey what is true, you act not from compulsion, but from recognition. Surrender becomes alignment, the harmony between awareness and reality. You do not obey to please another, but because resistance makes no sense once order is seen. Freedom without surrender collapses into chaos. Surrender without understanding becomes servitude. But when the two unite, obedience and freedom become the same movement, the quiet agreement between what knows and what is. Al-Ghazali taught that knowledge must be purified by obedience. To know something truly, you must let truth determine its own form. If you impose your preference upon it, you see only your reflection. Knowledge without obedience becomes argument. Obedience without knowledge becomes imitation. Only when both meet does wisdom arise. The obedient mind does not invent truth. It allows truth to define it. Such knowledge requires humility, the willingness to be corrected by reality. When you stop deciding what truth should be, it begins to show itself. The knower is free only when he no longer tries to govern what he learns. You begin to notice that obedience is not something added to life. It is the form life already takes. Every perception follows a law. Every conclusion depends on what came before it. You live inside a structure of cause, reason, and meaning. Even thought itself follows sequences it did not create. You are already obeying. To logic, to coherence, to existence. Al-Ghazali revealed that freedom is not escape from this order, but awareness within it. To resist the laws of being is to resist understanding. Freedom arises not by creating order, but by recognizing that you never stood outside it. Al-Ghazali's insight leads to an unexpected form of liberation. The mind becomes free not by controlling reality, but by ceasing to struggle against it. Obedience dissolves resistance. Resistance sustains illusion. When you align with truth, you act without inner division. The self that once sought autonomy now finds rest and clarity. There is no command left to obey because the act itself expresses order. This is not freedom of choice, but freedom from confusion. When truth becomes your direction, decision loses its weight. You move effortlessly, not because you are compelled, but because there is nothing left to oppose. As the need to control fades, thought grows still, not by force, but by understanding. You no longer alternate between obedience and defiance, because both belong to the same divided mind. Al-Ghazali's hidden practice was to observe until seeing replaced effort. When the self no longer demands recognition, obedience becomes awareness itself. What is real requires no defense. The mind now obeys without decision. It sees that every event, every truth, already follows its rightful place. The struggle to choose or resist ends. What remains is simple knowing, thought free of will, awareness free of conflict. You return to the beginning with a new understanding. What you once called obedience was never limitation. It was the form of order that makes freedom possible. To obey truth is to think without distortion. To resist it is to live in conflict with what is. Al-Ghazali's hidden practice shows that the highest freedom is not command over the world, but harmony with its reality. When the self no longer claims ownership over understanding, awareness moves freely through what is true. Nothing is lost, only the illusion of control. The paradox resolves itself. Obedience was never the enemy of freedom. It was the mirror of it, the state of mind that no longer needs to be free.